Near me, on the same steps, sat a little old woman, probably a cook who belonged to one of the families travelling to Europe. Her head hidden in her hands, she seemed to be whispering prayers. Suddenly, she threw a quick glance at me, and whether because she imagined that she saw some fatal resolution on my face, or for some other reason, anyway, she seized my arm, and in an imploring tone said to me with great earnestness, "No, Barin, nobody may do as he will with his life. You, no more than anybody else. We must accept what Providence sends us. Otherwise, it would mean taking your own life, and you would pay for that in the next world." I hadn't felt the least inclination to suicide, but now, out of some kind of bravado quite inexplicable in my position, I once or twice pretended to be about to carry out the intention she attributed to me, and each time the poor old woman would rush towards me to prevent what in her eyes would have been a crime. In the end, I felt a sort of shame, and stopped. And really, why this comedy in the presence of death, which at that moment genuinely seemed to me imminent and inevitable? However, there was no time either to meditate about the strangeness of these feelings, or to admire the absence of egoism. Today, it is called altruism of the poor old woman. For at this moment, the roaring of the flames above our heads redoubled in fury, when suddenly a voice of bronze, as it turned out, this was to be the voice of our rescuer, sounded above us. "What are you doing down there, you poor wretches? You will never escape. Follow me." And at once, knowing neither who was calling, nor where we had to go, the old woman and I jumped up as if propelled by a spring, and threw ourselves through the smoke, behind a sailor in a blue jacket, who was climbing up a rope ladder. Not knowing why, I too climbed the ladder behind him. I think that if at this moment he'd flung himself into the water, or had done something else, however extraordinary, I should have followed him blindly. Having hoisted himself up 2 or 3 rungs, the sailor jumped heavily down onto the roof of one of the carriages, the lower part of which was already in flames. I jumped after him, and heard the old woman jump behind me. Then, from the first carriage, the sailor jumped onto the second carriage, then onto a third, with me always behind him. In this way, we presently reached the bow of the ship. Nearly all the passengers were gathered there. The sailors, under the eye of the captain, were lowering one of our 2 lifeboats into the sea, fortunately the largest. Across the other side of the ship, I saw the steep line of cliffs that stretch along the shore towards Lübeck, lit up vividly by the fire. It was well over a mile to the foot of the cliff. I couldn't swim. The shoal on which we were grounded, without even noticing it, was probably shallow enough, but the waves were very high. Nevertheless, as soon as I saw the rocks, I was overwhelmed by the feeling that I was saved. To the astonishment of my companions, I jumped into the air several times and cried, "Hip hip hooray!" I had no wish to go towards the place where the crowd was swarming thickest, in order to reach the ladder which led to the big boat. There were too many women, old men, and children there. Besides, ever since I had seen the rocks, I was no longer in a hurry. I was certain that I was saved. I noticed with surprise that almost none of the children showed any fear. Several of them even fell asleep in their mother's arms. Not a single child perished. I noticed among a group of passengers a tall general, his clothes streaming with water. He was quite motionless, leaning on a bench which he had just pulled out of the wall and stood upright. I learnt that in the first moment of terror he had brutally pushed aside a woman who wanted to get in front of him in order to jump into one of the lifeboats that later capsized. One of the stewards threw him back onto the ship. The old soldier, ashamed of his moment of cowardice, swore he'd be the last to leave the ship, after the captain. Stately, pale, bleeding from a wound in the forehead, he stared with a crushed, resigned look upon his face, as if asking for forgiveness. In the meantime, I made my way toward the port side of the ship, and saw our little lifeboat dancing on the waves like a toy. 2 sailors were making signs from it, inviting the passengers to jump, but this was perilous and by no means easy. The Nicholas I was a high-decked steamer, and one had to drop with extreme skill not to upset the lifeboat. Finally, I decided to do it. I began by placing myself on the anchor chain, which was stretched alongside the ship. I was just about to leap when a soft, heavy mass fell on me. A woman clutched me round the neck and hung like a dead weight on me. I must admit, my first impulse was to force the hand off my neck and get rid of the mass by flinging it over my head. Most fortunately, I didn't yield to the impulse. The initial shock nearly threw us both into the water, but luckily, just in front of me, suspended from I don't know where, a piece of rope was waving in the air. I seized it with one hand so violently that it bled. Then, glancing down, I saw that my burden and I were just over the lifeboat. And, praise be to God, I slid down. The boat cracked in all its seams. Hooray, cried the sailors. I laid down my companion, who had in the meanwhile fainted, on the floor of the boat, and at once turned to look at the ship. I saw a multitude of heads, especially female ones, feverishly pressing alongside. "Jump!" I cried, stretching out my arms. At this moment, the success of my bold attempt, and my conviction that the flames couldn't reach me, filled me with unbelievable strength and courage, and I caught the only 3 women who ventured to jump into my boat as easily as apples tossed in an orchard. All these ladies, I may add, were always uttered a piercing scream before they jumped, and invariably fainted on arrival. One fellow, probably from sheer panic, nearly killed one of these unfortunate women by throwing a heavy travelling chest, which broke to pieces as it fell into our boat, revealing the valuable dressing case. Without asking myself whether I had the right to dispose of it, I immediately presented it to 2 sailors, who, just as unhesitatingly, accepted it. We at once started to row with all our might towards the shore, followed by cries of, "Come back quickly! Send us back the boat!" When the water was no more than about 3 feet deep, we therefore had to climb out. Fine cold drizzle had set in, more than an hour before. It had not the slightest effect on the fire, but us it drenched to the bone. Finally we reached the happy shore. The happy shore which turned out to be nothing but a gigantic pool of liquid, sticky mud into which we sank up to the knees. Our boat left rapidly, and like the bigger lifeboat, began to shuttle to and fro from ship to shore. Only a few passengers perished, 8 in all. One fell into a coal hole, another was drowned because he insisted on taking all his money with him. This last, whose name I hardly knew, played chess with me during most of the day with such fanaticism that Prince W., who had been watching our game, couldn't help explaining, "You look as if you were playing for your lives." As for the baggage, it was nearly all lost, including the carriages. Among the ladies rescued from the shipwreck, there was a Madame T., very pretty and charming, but encumbered by her 4 little girls and their nurses. Consequently, she was left deserted on the shore barefoot, her shoulders scarcely covered. I felt called upon to behave gallantly. This cost me my coat, which until then I had managed to preserve, my cravat, and even my boots. Furthermore, the peasant with a cart drawn by a couple of horses, whom I had gone to find on top of the cliff, and duly sent on to meet the ladies, didn't think it necessary to wait for me, and drove off to Lübeck with all my companions. So that I found myself alone, half naked, soaked to the skin, in sight of the sea, where our ship was slowly burning itself out. I say burning itself out deliberately, because I should never have believed such a huge contraption could be destroyed so fast. It was now no more than a large patch of flame, motionless on the surface of the sea, furrowed with the black silhouettes of funnels and masts. White seagulls, in their heavy, impassive flight, circled about it, and soon after, a vast clump of ash, strewn with tiny sparks, falling in large curves upon the, by now, more tranquil waves. And is this all, I thought? Is this our whole life then? Only a handful of ashes, scattered by the wind? Fortunately for the philosopher, whose teeth had begun to chatter violently, another carter picked me up. For this, the good man made me pay 2 ducats, but he did wrap me in his thick cloak, and sang to my benefit 2 or 3 Mecklenburg songs, which I thought quite pretty. I reached Lübeck at dawn. Here I met my fellow victims, and we went on to Hamburg together. There we found 20,000 silver rubles, which the Emperor Nicholas, who at that very moment happened to be passing through Berlin, had sent us by one of his equerries. The gentlemen unanimously agreed to offer this money to the ladies. It was all the easier for us to do this, since in those days any Russian traveller in Germany enjoyed unlimited credit. Now this is no longer so. The sailor, to whom I offered a fantastic sum of money in my mother's name for saving me, appeared to demand the fulfillment of my promise. But I wasn't quite sure whether he was the man, and since, moreover, he'd done absolutely nothing to rescue me, I offered him 1 thaler, which he was only too glad to accept. As for the poor old cook, who had been so concerned to save my soul, I never saw her again. But I feel quite happy about her. Whether she was roasted or drowned, she had a place reserved for her in paradise.